The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, golden streaks across the dusty plains as the bride's carriage rattled along the uneven dirt road. The rhythmic clatter of hooves against the earth and the creak of the carriage wheels were the only sounds that broke the vast silence surrounding her. She clutched the edges of her pale blue wedding dress, the fabric fluttering lightly in the warm evening breeze, and tried to steady her excitement. After months of planning, she was finally arriving at the town where she would begin her new life. She had imagined a warm welcome, townsfolk lining the streets, children waving, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery drifting through the air. But as the carriage rounded the last bend and the town came into view, a knot of unease twisted in her stomach. The town looked empty, not just quiet, but abandoned, as though its heart had been pulled away and left behind. Wooden buildings, weathered and sun-bleached, leaned slightly to one side. The windows were dusty, shutters hanging loosely, and the faint creak of a swinging sign above the general store was the only sound that suggested life. Not a single soul was visible in the streets. The bride squinted against the fading sunlight, hoping that she had simply arrived too early, that perhaps the townspeople were preparing some grand greeting she could not yet see. But as she gazed down the main street, the emptiness was complete. There were no welcoming smiles, no waves, no excited voices calling out to her. Her heart sank. She had imagined this moment so vividly, had dreamed of stepping into a community ready to celebrate her, and now she was faced with silence. The air felt heavier here, and the usual excitement that came with arriving at a new place was replaced by a strange, unshakable anxiety. The carriage slowed to a halt in front of the only inn she could make out, its sign swinging lazily in the breeze. She could see the outline of the door, and through the grimy windows, shadows of furniture and perhaps people moving, but no one came forward to greet her. Stepping down carefully from the carriage, the bride adjusted her veil and took a deep breath. The gravel crunched under her boots, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the empty street. She called out a polite greeting, a soft, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Her voice echoed against the wooden facades and quickly disappeared into the silence. A sudden shiver ran down her spine, though it had nothing to do with the cool evening air. Something about the quiet, the way the town seemed frozen in time, made her uneasy. She wondered if the townspeople had been scared of outsiders, or if some misfortune had recently befallen them. The bride's gaze traveled over the town once more. She noticed signs of life that had been abruptly abandoned, a rocking chair on a porch, a wagon tipped to one side, laundry hanging stiffly on a line, fluttering in the wind. It was as though the town had simply paused and forgotten to resume. The silence pressed on her from all sides, and the emptiness of the streets contrasted sharply with the vivid excitement she had imagined. Her wedding day, meant to be filled with laughter and celebration, now felt like a quiet trial of courage and patience. Yet even in that quiet desolation, there was something strangely inviting about the town. The soft golden light glimmered on the rooftops, and the mountains in the distance framed the horizon with majestic permanence. Perhaps this place, though lonely, held stories worth discovering. And so, with a tentative hope, she lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and prepared to face the town alone, unaware that her arrival had not gone unnoticed and that a small, curious pair of eyes would soon change everything. After leaving the carriage at the inn, the bride stepped carefully onto the creaking wooden porch, her heels clicking softly against the weathered planks. The inn's door loomed before her, its paint peeling in layers, revealing the gray wood beneath. She hesitated for a moment, listening for the faintest sign of life within, but the silence remained. Steeling herself, she pushed the door open, and a small bell tinkled weakly, announcing her presence. Inside, the inn smelled of old timber, dust, and the faint lingering aroma of coffee long brewed and long forgotten. The room was dimly lit, with sunlight filtering through grimy windows, casting muted patterns on the floor. A few chairs were scattered haphazardly, some tipped over as if abandoned in haste. Behind the counter, an elderly innkeeper appeared, a thin man with a lined face and wary eyes. He looked at her with polite curiosity, but offered no immediate welcome. "Good evening," the bride said softly, her voice carrying a warmth she hoped would reach him. "I'm here for my wedding." She paused, sensing the weight of the town's scrutiny. "I was hoping someone might greet me." The innkeeper's eyes flicked toward the windows as if checking for some unseen signal. "Welcome," he said at last, his voice careful, measured. We don't get many visitors these days. You'll find your room upstairs." He gestured vaguely toward the staircase, then returned to polishing a mug with a rag that had seen better days. There was a distance in his tone, a hesitancy that felt almost like caution, and it made the bride uneasy. As she carried her small trunk up the narrow staircase, she had time to take in the inn's details, the faded wallpaper curling at the edges, the muted carpet worn thin in spots, and the faint sounds of wind rattling the shutters. Every element of the building spoke of a place that had once been lively and full of laughter, but had been left to age quietly, almost forgotten. The bride's heart ached slightly for this town she had imagined as vibrant, now appearing so fragile and wary. After setting down her trunk, she moved to the window and looked out over the main street again. Shadows stretched long across the buildings, and the air carried a whisper of wind and dust. She noticed small, cautious movements behind curtains, or the flash of a hat disappearing around a corner. The townspeople were here, somewhere, but they kept their distance. She could sense their eyes on her, but none had dared to step forward. It felt as though the town itself was testing her, measuring her worthiness, gauging her intentions before allowing her inside its guarded heart. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of children's laughter far off, carried across the open plains. It was fleeting, almost dreamlike, but it reminded her that life persisted here despite appearances. Perhaps there was hope in this quiet place. Perhaps the town simply needed someone brave enough, kind enough, to rekindle the warmth that had been lost over time. The bride felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. This was not the grand, welcoming reception she had pictured in her mind, but it was real. She resolved to be patient, to learn the rhythm of the town, and to find the hearts hidden behind cautious eyes. The stillness that had first seemed ominous now appeared to her as a challenge, one that she was willing to meet. Somewhere in this town, she sensed, was the spark she had been sent to ignite, though she could not yet know how small a pair of curious eyes would guide her toward it. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, she felt the quiet promise of beginnings, of connections yet to be made, of trust yet to be earned, and of a story that would unfold far beyond the empty streets and weary faces that greeted her arrival. The bride's room in the inn was small but modest, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a wooden dresser scarred by years of use, and a single chair tucked into the corner. The window offered a view of the empty street below, the sunlight now softened into the warm tones of late afternoon. She set down her trunk and ran her fingers along the quilt, feeling the history woven into its fabric. Every corner of the inn spoke of patience, resilience, and quiet endurance, much like the town itself. Descending the staircase again, she returned to the main room where the innkeeper continued to tidy the place with a measured, almost cautious rhythm. He did not ask many questions, and she did not push. There was an unspoken understanding that trust had to be earned here, that any intrusion without care would be met with suspicion. The bride sensed it immediately. This was a town scarred by past hardships, a community shaped by fear, loss, and the slow grind of years that had left them wary of outsiders. "Would you like some supper?" the innkeeper asked finally, placing a rough wooden tray on the counter. "It's nothing fancy, just bread, stew, and whatever's left in the pantry. But it's warm." His voice was quieter now, almost hesitant, as if even the offer of food was a test. "I'd be glad for anything," the bride replied, her smile gentle. She did not wish to impose, only to belong in some small way, even if it was temporary. As she ate, she allowed her eyes to wander over the room. There were signs of life here, though subtle. A broom leaned against the wall. Footprints in the dust suggested recent cleaning, and a small shelf held jars of preserves and dried herbs. The inn was not abandoned, it was simply cautious, like its people. After supper, she stepped outside for a brief walk along the street. The shadows had deepened, stretching long and thin across the wooden storefronts. The silence was profound, but now it felt less threatening and more contemplative, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of presents she would bring. She noticed a few windows with faint flickers of candlelight, suggesting families huddled inside, peeking through curtains to observe the newcomer who had dared to arrive unannounced. The bride paused near the edge of the street and closed her eyes. She could hear the soft creak of a sign swinging in the wind, the distant bark of a dog, and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. It was in this quiet that she began to understand the unspoken rules of the town. Patience would be rewarded. Gentleness would be acknowledged. Bravery, tempered with humility, might even be embraced. But force or arrogance would only deepen the walls the townspeople had built around themselves. Returning to the inn, she found the innkeeper sitting quietly behind the counter, finishing his own simple meal. He glanced at her briefly and nodded, a subtle acknowledgment of her presence, neither warmth nor hostility, but recognition nonetheless. It was progress, small but meaningful, and she felt a flicker of hope. As she prepared for bed, the bride thought about the day's arrival, the empty streets, the cautious glances, and the solitude of the inn. She realized that she had stepped into a town that had lost its warmth, a place that had suffered and learned to protect itself by keeping strangers at a distance. But she also understood that every town, no matter how wary, had a heart. Somewhere, beneath the fear and hesitation, the people longed for connection, for kindness, for someone to remind them of the good that still existed. And as she lay beneath the quilt, the sounds of the night whispering through the wooden walls, she resolved to find that heart. She did not yet know where it would be found, but she felt certain that the first steps had been taken. The bride had arrived, and though no one had greeted her with cheers or flowers, she had entered a story waiting to unfold. A story of trust healing and unexpected bonds beginning quietly in a lonely inn at the edge of a weary town. The following morning the bride woke to the soft light of dawn spilling through the dusty inn windows. The town was still quiet, though now the streets appeared slightly less foreboding in the gentle glow of morning. She decided to explore further, feeling that she could not simply wait in the inn while the mystery of the town's cold reception lingered over her. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped outside, careful not to startle the few townsfolk who lingered in the shadows of doorways. Her first encounter was with an older woman tending a small garden behind a weathered picket fence. The woman's hands were calloused, her face lined with age and sun, and yet her eyes were sharp, assessing. "You're not from here," the woman said without preamble. There was no malice, but the tone carried the weight of years spent protecting a fragile community from outsiders. "No," the bride admitted gently. "I'm new. I've come for my wedding. I hope to meet the people of the town, to know them." The woman studied her carefully. "Few visitors come these days, and fewer stay. You may find the town doesn't always welcome strangers the way you expect." She paused, then added, softer this time, "There are reasons for that, if you're willing to listen." Curiosity pricked at the bride's heart. She nodded, encouraging the woman to continue. "Years ago," the woman began, her voice low, almost a whisper, "our town was not so quiet. It was full of laughter and life. But then there was trouble, fires, sickness, a dispute that tore families apart. Outsiders came and went, and some left pain in their wake. Ever since, the people here have been cautious. Trust is earned slowly, if at all. The bride felt a pang of sympathy. She had imagined a warm reception, and yet she now understood that the town as emptiness was not born of cruelty, but of survival. Their silence was a shield, their distance a form of self-preservation. She realized that every empty street and wary glance was a story of fear, loss, and lingering sorrow. As she continued her walk, she noticed other hints of the town's secrets. A boarded-up schoolhouse, the charred remains of a barn at the far edge of town, and a cemetery overgrown with weeds where names on the headstones spoke of families lost and struggles endured. Each fragment whispered of a past that the town had tried to bury but could not forget. Even the children she glimpsed from behind curtains carried the quiet caution of their elders. They were curious but careful, peeking and then retreating. The bride understood that this wariness was taught early, a lesson passed down to ensure that no one could easily harm them again. Returning to the inn, she shared a brief conversation with the innkeeper, who confirmed the stories she had gathered. "The town has been hurt," he said quietly, "many times. People have come, people have left, and some have taken more than they gave. We are slow to trust now, but not impossible to reach." The bride left the inn that evening with a growing determination. She realized that her presence, though initially unwelcomed, could be a chance to heal old wounds. To the townspeople, she might be a stranger, but she could also become a bridge, a gentle reminder that kindness could still exist, even in a place hardened by misfortune. And while the town's secrets were heavy, they were not insurmountable. She began to see that behind every cautious glance and empty street was the potential for connection, for trust, and for the return of hope. Somewhere in the quiet town, she sensed, there was a spark waiting to be lit, one that would reveal not just the town's pain, but also its enduring capacity for warmth and renewal. The next morning, the bride rose before dawn, restless with a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. She had explored much of the town the previous day, piecing together its silent history, but there was still a sense of mystery she could not unravel alone. Drawn by the soft sounds of birdsong and the distant clatter of hooves, she wandered along the edge of the town, near the fields where cattle grazed and the wind whispered through the tall grasses. It was there, at the boundary between the worn wooden buildings and the open plains, that she first saw the child. A small figure, barely taller than the fence posts, was perched on a fence rail, her hat tipped back slightly, hair tousled by the morning breeze. She clutched a well-worn lasso in one hand and balanced with the easy grace of someone who had grown up on horseback. Her eyes, bright and fearless, locked onto the bride immediately. The bride approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Good morning," she said gently, offering a tentative smile. The girl tilted her head, studying the bride with a seriousness that made her seem older than her years. Then, in a voice clear and unwavering, she asked the question that would echo in the bride's heart. "Are you the angel Mama sent?" The bride froze, startled by the innocence and directness of the question. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard. "Angel?" she repeated softly, a mixture of confusion and curiosity in her voice. I don't know what you mean," the girl shrugged, a small, earnest gesture. "Mama said someone kind would come, someone who would help the town feel happy again. Is that you?" A warm rush of emotion swept through the bride. She knelt down slightly to meet the girl's gaze, noticing the raw honesty in her eyes, the trust she offered without hesitation. This small child, unburdened by the caution that clung to the adults of the town, saw something in her, something that the bride had not yet fully recognized in herself. She realized with a sudden clarity that her presence here was not only noticed but needed. I hope so," the bride said finally, her voice trembling with both humility and hope. "I want to help if I can. I want to bring kindness where it's been missing." The girl smiled, a small but radiant curve of lips, and nodded approvingly. "Then maybe you are the angel." She swung her legs over the fence and began walking alongside the bride, unafraid of the dust and the uneven ground. As they moved together, the bride learned that the girl's mother had been a beloved figure in the town, someone whose warmth and generosity had been remembered long after she passed. The girl spoke of small acts of care, of meals shared and hands held in times of sorrow, painting a picture of the community before its heartbreak. With every step, the bride felt a growing sense of connection, not just to the girl, but to the town itself. The little girl's trust was a bridge to the heart she had yet to reach, a reminder that even in a place scarred by loss, hope could take root again. For the first time since her arrival, the bride felt truly welcomed, not by the town at large, but by its most innocent and perceptive member. By the time they returned toward the inn, the bride knew that this encounter had changed everything. The child's simple, unwavering belief in her kindness had ignited a spark within the bride, a determination to bring warmth and healing to the weary town. And though the streets remained quiet and the townspeople still cautious, she carried with her the unspoken promise of connection, the first step toward mending the silence and the sorrow that hung heavy over the town. After the morning encounter with the little girl, the bride felt a new sense of purpose as she moved through the quiet town. Each step seemed lighter, each glance at the worn buildings tinged with curiosity rather than trepidation. The girl who had introduced herself as Clara stayed close at her side, her small hand brushing against the bride's arm now, and then a reminder that trust could be offered freely even when the rest of the world remained wary. As they walked toward the center of town, Clara began to tell the bride about her mother, a woman whose kindness had left an indelible mark on the people around her. "Mama always said the town needed someone to believe in," Clara explained, her voice carrying both pride and sorrow. "She used to bake bread for anyone who was hungry, even strangers. She would listen to people's troubles and never laugh at them. She said an angel might come one day to finish what she started." The bride listened intently, touched by the little girl's words. She realized that the town's cold reception was not just caution. It was grief. The townspeople had lost someone who had been a true heart of the community, and they had not yet dared to hope again. The girl's innocent belief in the bride's arrival as a kind of angel was a spark of that hope, fragile but unmistakable. As they passed the general store, a few townsfolk peeked from behind curtains or from the edges of doorways. Their eyes lingered on the bride, curious but cautious, watching to see how she would respond. Clara, unbothered, waved cheerfully to one of them. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. This is her, the angel Mama told us about." The bride felt a mixture of surprise and warmth. She turned to the man behind the curtain and offered a gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. It was a small gesture, but the first real connection she had with the townspeople, a tentative recognition that she was not just an intruder, but someone willing to engage with them on their terms. Clara led the bride to a small garden behind the inn, a place her mother had tended with care. Though it was overgrown, the flowers and herbs still showed signs of life. The bride knelt beside Clara, and together they began to weed and water, tending to the neglected plants. As they worked, the bride felt a sense of kinship growing, not just with Clara, but with the memory of her mother and the spirit of the community she had nurtured. Through these small acts, the bride began to see the beginnings of real connection. Clara's trust was unwavering, and the townspeople, though hesitant, were watching, absorbing her actions. Every kind word, every patient gesture, slowly chipped away at the walls of suspicion that had defined the town for so long. The bride realized that her role here was not just to be welcomed, but to help the town remember its own capacity for warmth and generosity. By evening, a few townsfolk had ventured closer, drawn by the sight of the bride and Clara working together, laughing quietly as they nurtured life from the soil. A neighbor placed a basket of fresh eggs on the inn's doorstep, an unspoken invitation to join in, to belong. The bride's heart swelled with gratitude. She had not yet won the town's full trust, but she had found the first threads of connection, the beginnings of a bond that could heal old wounds. As the sun set, painting the sky with strokes of pink and gold, the bride stood with Clara, looking out over the town. In the child's eyes, she saw hope, recognition, and the promise of what could be. For the first time, the bride understood that her arrival was more than a journey to wed. It was the start of a journey to restore faith, warmth, and life to a town that had long forgotten how to hope. Despite the small victories of the morning, the bride quickly realized that not everyone in the town was ready to embrace her presence. Whispers followed her along the streets, eyes darted nervously from behind shutters, and old men on worn benches muttered to each other in low tones. Even with Clara at her side, their laughter and gardening efforts were met with cautious suspicion. The bride sensed that while a child's innocence could open a door, the adults carried memories and fears that would not be so easily swayed. It began with subtle slights. A shopkeeper refused to make eye contact when she passed, muttering something about outsiders meddling where they don't belong. The blacksmith, a tall man with thick arms and a stern face, crossed the street to avoid her. Invitations to dinner or conversation were rare, and when offered, they were perfunctory at best, as if she were an unwelcome guest tolerated only because of Clara's insistence. The bride felt the weight of it acutely. Every cautious glance, every whispered comment reminded her that she was walking into a town still steeped in fear and disappointment. She understood that her intentions, however sincere, were not enough to erase years of hurt. Slowly, she began to realize that winning over this community would take patience, resilience, and consistent proof of her goodwill. Yet the resistance also had an undercurrent of curiosity. Though many townsfolk avoided her directly, they watched from safe distances. Children lingered on porches, curious about the stranger working in the garden with Clara. The innkeeper observed her interactions quietly, his lined face unreadable but attentive. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting to see if she was truly worthy of trust or if she would disappoint them like so many before. Determined not to falter, the bride chose to respond with patience and kindness. She greeted everyone she passed, even those who ignored her, with a soft smile and a nod. She helped wherever she could, tending to the injured horse left outside the blacksmith's shop, offering to carry baskets for neighbors, or simply listening when someone dared to speak to her. Every small act was a test, and every rejection a challenge, but she met them with quiet resolve. Clara remained her constant companion, reminding her that change often started with one small spark. "They're just scared," the child said one afternoon as they watched a group of men glance her way, then turn away. "You have to show them you're not going to hurt them." "That's what Mama said." The bride took those words to heart. Slowly, the subtle hostility began to soften, though it was far from gone. A widow nodded in acknowledgement when the bride helped carry water to the garden. The blacksmith's apprentice lingered a moment longer than necessary, watching her hands skillfully repair a broken fence. Even the innkeeper allowed a small, approving smile when she cleared and polished the common room without being asked. By the end of the day, the bride felt both the weight and the promise of the town's resistance. It was a challenge, yes, but also an opportunity, a chance to show through deeds rather than words that she was not merely a visitor, but someone willing to nurture the community in ways it had long forgotten. The townspeople had walls around their hearts, built brick by brick from grief and caution, and she would need time, patience, and courage to dismantle them. As the sun set behind the distant hills, casting a golden glow over the silent streets, the bride and Clara returned to the inn. The town had not yet embraced her, but the first cracks in its defenses were visible. In Clara's eyes, she saw hope. In the distant silhouettes of townsfolk, she saw curiosity. And in herself she felt a quiet determination to turn suspicion into trust and isolation into community, one gentle act at a time. The days that followed were filled with quiet, deliberate acts that slowly began to reshape the town's perception of the bride. She rose each morning before the sun, tending to small chores in the town and at the inn, always with Clara by her side. Each task she undertook was simple, yet intentional, meant not only to help, but to show the townsfolk that her heart was true and her intention sincere. It began with the small things. She mended torn fences along the outskirts of the town, smoothing rough edges and replacing broken boards. Children watched from behind fences and windows as she worked, their curiosity tempered with awe. Some ventured closer, daring to ask questions or offer a helping hand, and the bride welcomed their company, laughing softly as they stumbled or fumbled through tasks under her gentle guidance. She visited the infirm, carrying baskets of fresh bread and jars of preserves. One morning she found Mrs. Caldwell, a widow who had long kept to her home, struggling to lift a bucket of water. The bride hurried to assist, holding the bucket and offering a comforting smile. "Let me help you," she said softly. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes, clouded by years of caution, softened at last, and she allowed the bride to stay and help tend her small garden. Word began to spread quietly. Though the townsfolk still watched with wary eyes, whispers of the bride's kindness circulated. A man at the blacksmith shop grunted a quiet acknowledgment as she repaired a broken harness. The shopkeeper began leaving small bundles of flour and sugar at the inn's doorstep, unspoken tokens of gratitude. Even the elderly innkeeper, who had once been cautious to the point of avoidance, began to offer helpful advice and gentle encouragement. Clara remained the bride's steadfast companion, her joy infectious. The little girl would skip ahead through the streets, greeting neighbors and telling them, "She's helping us. She's the angel Mama said would come." Her innocence became a bridge between the bride and the town, breaking down walls of suspicion one smile at a time. The bride also organized small communal tasks, like repairing the roof of the schoolhouse and cleaning the overgrown paths near the church. Slowly, people joined not because they were forced, but because they wanted to. They were drawn by the bride's unwavering patience, her willingness to share laughter, and her genuine care for both the living and the memory of those who had passed. Evenings became moments of quiet celebration. Families lingered outside their homes to share simple conversations. The bride would sit with Clara under the fading light, watching the townspeople interact. Though subtle, there was a change, a softening of eyes, the easing of postures, the hesitant emergence of smiles. The town was responding, slowly but unmistakably, to her presence. By the end of the week, it was clear that the bride's acts of kindness had begun to weave her into the fabric of the community. She was no longer a stranger, and the once silent streets no longer felt empty. The townsfolk, while still cautious, had started to believe again in the goodness that her arrival represented. The bride, standing with Clara on a small rise overlooking the town, felt a sense of quiet triumph. She knew the journey was far from over, the town's wounds ran deep, but she also recognized that every act of kindness, every gesture of care, was a step toward healing. In the eyes of the child beside her, she saw hope shining bright, and in the tentative glances of the townspeople, she glimpsed the possibility of a future where trust, warmth, and community could flourish once more. One late afternoon, as the bride walked with Clara through the outskirts of town, they came upon an old, abandoned barn at the edge of the plains. Its boards were warped and splintered, the roof sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. Something about the place drew her closer, a feeling she could not ignore. Clara trailed beside her, curious but unafraid, as if sensing that this place held truths long hidden. Inside the barn, the air smelled of dust, straw, and forgotten memories. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, illuminating the faded letters of a sign once hung above the door, Caldwell & Sons, General Store. The bride's eyes lingered on the remnants of shelves, broken crates, and rusted tools. Then, tucked away in a corner, she discovered an old journal, its cover worn and edges frayed. She carefully opened it, the pages filled with neat, flowing handwriting, the memoir of a woman who had once been central to this town's heart. As she read, the bride discovered the town's long-hidden pain. Years ago, a series of misfortunes had struck: fires that consumed homes, a harsh winter that claimed livestock, and a feud that divided families. But at the center of it all had been a woman beloved by the community, the mother of Clara. Her generosity had been immense, yet she had been powerless to stop the tragedies, and the town had struggled to cope with loss. Her death left a vacuum that fear, suspicion, and grief quickly filled. Outsiders were blamed, kindness was questioned, and the townspeople learned to shield themselves from further hurt. The bride felt a lump rise in her throat. She realized now why the town had been so cold to her arrival. It was not malice, but a deep-seated fear that history might repeat itself. Their mistrust was the armor of a community that had been wounded too many times, a legacy of sorrow they had yet to release. Clara, sensing the bride's absorption in the journal, whispered softly, "Mama always wanted someone to finish what she started. Maybe that's you." The bride looked at the girl, her small hand resting lightly on the journal. Tears pricked at her eyes as she nodded. She understood that her role here was more than that of a newcomer or even a bride. She was now a bridge between past and present, a living reminder of hope and healing. Determined to address the town's unspoken grief, she returned to the main street and sought out those who had been the most wary. She spoke gently of the mother's legacy, of her courage, her kindness, and her unwavering care for the community. She acknowledged the pain the town had endured and expressed her desire to help carry forward the spirit of generosity that had been lost. Slowly, the townspeople began to respond. Eyes softened, shoulders relaxed, and tentative conversations emerged where silence had ruled. The widow from across the street allowed herself a small smile. The blacksmith offered a nod of respect. Even the innkeeper spoke words of gratitude for her efforts and her willingness to honor the memory of those who had come before. By evening, a subtle shift had taken place. The town, while not yet fully healed, had begun to confront its own past alongside her. The bride had become a catalyst, helping them face their sorrow while showing them that trust and warmth could exist once more. Clara's hand in hers was a quiet reminder that change often began with a single act of courage, a single voice of kindness in a place long silenced by fear. As the sun set behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the town, the bride felt a sense of purpose deeper than any she had known. She was no longer simply a visitor. She had become a part of the story, the living proof that even in a town marked by loss, hope could return, one heart at a time. The morning of the wedding arrived with a crisp clarity that seemed to mirror the town's slow but steady thawing of hearts. Sunlight poured over the rooftops, glinting on the wooden sidewalks and reflecting off the dust-swept streets. Birds chirped, and a faint breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh bread, the small, everyday tokens of a town slowly remembering life and warmth. The bride, dressed in her pale blue gown, felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. Unlike the day she had first arrived, the streets were no longer empty. Townsfolk had begun to emerge from their homes, hesitant at first, yet drawn by curiosity, respect, and the quiet trust she had nurtured. Children peeked from behind fences, waving shyly, while a few adults offered nods and small smiles. It was not the grand welcome she had imagined, but it was something far more meaningful, genuine acknowledgement earned through patience, kindness, and connection. Clara ran ahead, her small hat tilted jauntily, her laughter ringing through the streets. "Everyone, she's here! The angel Mama sent," she called, her voice carrying the innocent authority only a child could command. Her words were simple, yet they held weight, dissolving the last of the town's hesitation. As the bride walked down the main street toward the small wooden chapel, the townspeople stepped forward, no longer hiding, no longer merely observing. Faces once guarded now carried warmth. The widow who had been wary of her the previous week held out a hand, offering congratulations. The blacksmith tipped his hat, and even the innkeeper approached, eyes shining with unspoken respect. The town, which had greeted her with silence and suspicion, now opened its doors and hearts in a quiet, heartfelt celebration. The bride's steps felt lighter than ever, each movement accompanied by the soft murmur of greetings and well wishes. She looked at Clara, who skipped beside her with a radiant smile, and felt the weight of her journey lift slightly. It had been a long road from empty streets and cautious eyes to this moment of belonging, and it was all made possible by one small, fearless child who had seen the truth of her heart before anyone else. Inside the chapel, friends and neighbors gathered. The bride noticed familiar faces, each one representing a step in the slow healing of the town. They had watched her acts of kindness, observed her patience and courage, and chosen to believe in the goodness she brought. For the first time since her arrival, she truly felt the embrace of a community. The ceremony itself was simple, reflecting the town's modest ways, yet it was filled with profound warmth. Laughter mingled with tears, and stories of the past were acknowledged, honored, and allowed to become part of the present rather than a source of fear. Clara, beaming beside the bride, whispered, "See? Everyone believes now." The bride smiled, knowing that this trust had been hard-won, nurtured gently, and protected carefully over days of persistence. After the ceremony, the townspeople gathered outside, offering food, stories, and companionship. The streets were alive with conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the silent welcome that had greeted her arrival. The bride moved among them, greeting each person with genuine warmth, feeling the transformation of a town that had once been frozen by fear. Standing with Clara on a small rise overlooking the bustling streets, the bride felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had arrived alone, uncertain, and unwelcomed. Now she was embraced, celebrated, and cherished not just as a bride, but as a bridge between the town's sorrowful past and its hopeful future. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town that had once been silent, she realized something profound. Sometimes, the warmest welcome comes not from the grandeur of gestures, but from the courage to care, the patience to endure, and the small, brave hearts that recognize the goodness in others before anyone else does.